No, I'm not on safari, and this isn't Kruger National Park in South Africa. It's actually Melbourne Zoo, Australia's oldest and one of the world's oldest zoos. These days, it's a lush sanctuary for both man and beast, a far cry from those cramped, archaic enclosures for so long we've called zoos.
They're among the oldest institutions in the world. Art through the ages has depicted a menagerie of exotic animals as a symbol of pride and power. Today, the curiosity lives on, with more than 500 million people visiting zoos annually. But man's fascination with the animal world is changing. With the emphasis today on conservation and education, there's now less tolerance of animals as a spectacle, catering to the amusement of the masses.
People's expectations these days when they come to a zoo have increased greatly. No longer do they want to see a collection of animals in cages. They expect and they want to be educated. They want to know about the animal's habitat. They want to know what obviously the usual things, life expectancy, what the animals eat. But they also want to know where they come from, and the best way we've found to educate the people, to educate the public, is to give the animals as natural an environment as is possible.
Paul O'Donoghue is one of the new breed of curators that have been infiltrating zoos for the past 2 decades. His emphasis on respect rather than derision of the animals reflects a growing desire to educate the public rather than simply amuse it. And Melbourne Zoo is playing a key role in conservation programs throughout Australia, New Zealand and Southeast Asia.
The wild is not this great panacea where everything is perfect. I think everyone is aware that animals are becoming extinct, animals are being poached. There is a lot of pressure on land in the wild, in Africa, in Asia, with the burgeoning population. People need land to live in. That puts pressure on animals. I worked in Africa 20 years ago, and the general conception there was that perhaps not in our lifetime, but in our children's lifetime, there's going to be so much pressure on land that the wild as we know it, or as we knew it then and as we know it to a certain extent now, is going to be gone, and the animals are going to be kept in large fenced areas. And that was 20 years ago, and it is going that way in the wild now.
Melbourne was one of the first cities to adopt the concept of the urban zoo. Back in 1862, the founding Zoological Society of Victoria began importing exotic animals and plants to add interest to the Australian native landscape. At that time, zoos provided the only opportunity for people to satisfy their curiosity about the strange creatures being met by European explorers and early settlers throughout the empire. Most of the world's zoo showcases boasted manicured gardens and elaborate structures, but did little to meet the real needs of the animals. Many creatures from the tropics suffered because of the mistaken belief they would die if they weren't kept in overheated cages. Ignorance was rife, and the survival rate reflected it. Melbourne Zoo was one of the first to look at zoos in a different light. Public sentiment began to change in the late 60s. Visitors to the zoo no longer wanted to ride the elephant or poke fun at the tigers. The zoo was becoming a major tourist attraction, and public opinion demanded more than a few cosmetic changes. Over the years, bars began to disappear, and an ambitious redevelopment program started to unfold. But it was no easy transition.
It is far easier to look after an animal when it's in a cage with a concrete bottom. When an animal is in a large, almost open range environment, you still have to manage them, you have to look after them, because remember they are in captivity. It does throw up other problems, such as making sure there's nothing that can injure them, making sure they can't escape, obviously. But this is part of the way that the zoo is evolving and the way that managing animals is evolving. It's too simple doing it the other way.
Changes at Melbourne Zoo began in earnest in the late 80s with the adoption of a 25-year master plan. Today, animals can be viewed in the African and Asian rainforest areas. But 15 years into the next century, a savanna, tropical area and woodland will combine with aviaries, reptile and butterfly houses and seal ponds to meet the demands of more than 1 million visitors a year. It's an ambitious project and not without its sticking points. The zoo's modernisation program involves the demolition of several animal enclosures, including those belonging to the elephant and giraffe exhibits. But that, according to Victoria's Heritage Lobby, is not on.
They are on the register of the National Estate, which means they are important to the whole nation as a whole. They're also important to the state of Victoria. They represent a very unusual design. The elephant house is just fabulous, it really is. What we would want to see is that those enclosures preserved in some way, not necessarily with elephants or giraffes in them, and in fact most people who have visited the zoo would recognise that those enclosures are no longer suitable for giraffes or elephants or any other large animal. However, they could be recycled and used for all sorts of other things.
But the issue, according to the zoo, is about space. With a total display area of about 22 hectares, there are no prospects of increasing any external boundaries.
This is a finite space, and if we're developing an elephant enclosure 5 times its size on the other side of the zoo, to maintain that elephant enclosure here on space that would be taken over by veterinary facilities is a difficult thing to do. The exhibits themselves are not an end, they're a means to an end, and it alters over time. The master plan has set out an historic precinct, and you can see the beginnings of that down the main drive at the moment. We don't have to be told to preserve our history. This zoo is one of the oldest zoos in the world, and we're proud of that history.
The dispute came to a head recently with a grant from the Heritage Council and permission to knock down the back wall of the giraffe enclosure. But this is as far as it goes. The enclosures themselves have been added to the Victorian Heritage Register, and while the demolition compromise means a new exhibit can be built to house the giraffe, zebra and ostrich, the biggest headache for zoo authorities is still the elephant enclosure. This stays in its entirety and will probably become part of a new administration and veterinary area. The elephants will be moved eventually. They've outgrown their archaic residence and a new larger enclosure is planned over the next few years. Fundraising is on in earnest, but the $3 million required is a tall order, and until it's a reality, the elephants stand forlorn in an obsolete caricature of their habitat.
My own association with Melbourne Zoo goes back to 1980 when I did my first report for National 9 News. But over the years, you can't help but make a few friends.
So now, just 2 days later, our little friend is officially off the critical list. Because the twins are so popular, the zoo plans to celebrate all their birthdays.
Possums, particularly newborns like this one, are the worst fire-affected species.
Zoo officials are hoping Rigo will mellow in his old age, and he's got plenty of time.
So if you can think of something appropriate to call the baby gorilla, then enter the competition.
But from this spot you'll be able to see the pandas, but don't expect a private viewing. Zoo organisers...
As far as the zebras are concerned, zoo officials are hoping the new surroundings will be conducive to 770,000 people passed through the turnstiles, likely to live until he's 70. Jo Hall, National 9 News.
It's a bit like looking through the family album, isn't it? But of all the animal stories we've done here at the Melbourne Zoo, I still have a soft spot for one boy in particular.
Missouri was the first gorilla born at Melbourne Zoo, and in a city which identifies with its own, the public went wild. The little primate is the only surviving gorilla to be born by artificial insemination, and Melbourne adored him. So much so that when he was transferred to Jersey Zoo in 1993 on breeding loan, the city went into mourning.
It's a bit sad for the kids. They liked him.
I will miss him.
But Melbourne's national treasure has been forgiven for absconding. His much heralded baby son has now brought a new gene line into the British Isles. These days, the move is away from celebrity status and public spectacle. Birthday parties are rare, and even individual names are used carefully to avoid confusing the animal. Staff usually have a stud book name for animals, which is different from the name sometimes chosen by the public.
Most zoos no longer house their primate population in cages like this. Remember the days when monkeys were given bottles of beer and cigarettes to make us laugh? Well, attitudes towards these animals have changed radically. Not only is their food and habitat considered, but also the animal's dignity.
And it was the primates which were ridiculed most. Their human characteristics put them easily into the buffoon mould, always a target of derision, always a long-suffering simpleton. But today the pride of the primates is being restored in many zoos around the world, and not the least in our own at Royal Park. Melbourne Zoo has the only gorilla group in the Australasian region, and these lodges are given 5-star accommodation. But this gourmet triumph is only breakfast. A similar ritual occurs 3 times a day, with the gorilla food bill topping about $1,200 a week, and that's just for fruit and veg. Nutrition is foremost in these kitchens, an undertaking which sets Melbourne Zoo back $400,000 a year and which quashes any popular notion that apes only enjoy bananas. Huge inroads have been made in recreating the animal's habitat, an environment without bars and where temperature, humidity, soil and vegetation are controlled to reproduce varying terrain from rainforest to desert. It's a long way from the poorly ventilated, cramped cages of 20 years ago.
We have to be selling our product, almost, if that's not being too crass about it, in a way that's going to keep our visitors coming back. And our visitors are expecting us to be portraying our animals in as naturalistic a manner as we can possibly do. We're not saying it's natural, we're saying it's naturalistic, in that we are trying to replicate habitats in which the animals live. And that's very much a part of a critically important message of trying to involve or talk to our communities, talk to our visitors and involve them in habitat protection, habitat conservation. Without habitats, we don't have anything. Society is changing, and in many ways zoos reflect changes in society. It's no longer good enough to just have an animal in a bare cage with concrete and wire.
Zoos today are no longer an indiscriminate collection of animals on display. Melbourne Zoo is part of a regional group comprising Australia, New Zealand and Papua New Guinea, which is linked with a much larger global network. These factors play a major part in any decision concerning the animals.
Even before the animals are here, quite a number of them are actually part of management plans, existing management plans. So we know which animals we're getting, we know what their relationships are to other animals in the region or elsewhere in the world. And so that knowledge then dictates to a point what we do with them, whom we breed with whom, how many we produce, where those animals go, all those sorts of factors.
The zoo's western lowland gorillas are part of an international breeding program aimed at preserving the species. Housing gorillas in groups improves their social behaviour and is more likely to lead to successful breeding. But not everyone wants a mate. 26-year-old Rigo did his bit when he fathered Missouri, but these days efforts to find him a partner have proved futile and in some cases dangerous for any potential bedfellow. As a result of his lost libido, Rigo is kept separate from the clan. Passion now little more than a memory. It's the change of seasons and a balmy night is creeping over Werribee on the western outskirts of Melbourne. But this is a place very far from the madding crowd, a spiritual landscape which reflects man's relationship with all creatures great. Werribee's Open Range Zoo is one place where the law of the jungle doesn't apply. In fact, this is the animal kingdom's answer to five-star comfort.
The future direction of zoos, I think, is very much towards becoming real conservation centres where we are serious about conservation issues, conveying those to the public in an entertaining way and hopefully in a way which encourages people to change their behaviour, to change their lifestyles. Really a place that's about getting information across.
And that's exactly what Werribee Zoo has been working towards over the past few years. For a long time, the zoo, with its sweeping escarpment and savanna-like floodplain, has played second fiddle to its urban counterpart. Tucked away off the Princes Highway, few people realise it's more than a few animals roaming behind the majestic Werribee Park mansion. But in December, the zoo enters a new phase, which will move it into a world-class sphere. 200 hectares where visitors can take a bus safari half an hour from Melbourne, enjoy a good bottle of red in the restaurant overlooking a range of wildlife, or take a hike along the Werribee River amid the rhino, zebra and giraffe. It is, as zoo director Gay Hamilton says, a unique experience.
We wanted to build the world's best open range zoo, focusing on the grasslands and the savannas that were once native to this area, and to create immediate impact so that when visitors first walk in, there's this really stunning landscape.
These animals were extremely important to the American Indian. They were a major food source. He also used them for clothing and for shelter. The horns were used to make tools, and even their dried dung was used for fuel for their fires.
There are no bars at Werribee Zoo. It's a visitor who's confined to a safari bus. Experienced guides answer any questions relating to the animal's habitat or behaviour.
If you look very carefully, has anyone spotted the hippos yet? No. They're looking a little bit like rocks. Yeah. Over the other side there. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Now, don't be fooled by how passive they look just lying there in the water. Hippos can actually be quite dangerous. They've killed more humans in Africa than lions have.
We've really tried to cater for most of the animals' needs. The animals have free grazing. They are a grazing animal, vegetarians. Hippos do move around a lot, particularly at night in the wild, so we've given them plenty of room. They obviously have plenty of water. Water's important to hippos. They're amphibious animals. We've tried to give them social opportunities, which is why in this case we've got 3 females together. Female hippos do live together in quite large pods, as they're called. We've really tried to cater for all of the key aspects of the animal's biology in this exhibit.
As head curator, Peter Stroud oversees the zoo's 400 animals. He's instrumental in keeping conditions close to their natural habitat with as little human intervention as possible. But you'll see more than the deer and antelope playing in these parts. With scenes reminiscent of the Ark, it's not unusual to find waterbuck rubbing noses with giraffe, zebra with rhino, although some animals are more highly strung than others.
The perception of the public has really changed towards a more respectful attitude towards animals. I think zoos have been part of promoting that, and we certainly see it as one of our roles, a key role in fact. But I think the word that does stand out to me is respect. I think people have always enjoyed animals, they've always found animals entertaining, but I think we've become a lot more respectful of animals as we've learned more about environmental issues, and we've needed to know more about animals and how the way we live fits into their world.
Wildlife parks are now an essential part of any good modern zoo, and Werribee operates in close association with Melbourne Zoo. But while most people prefer to see animals in wide open spaces, it isn't always what the animals want.
There's always a lot of in a sense, deception, because some animals that you put in big spaces really like big spaces. I mean, for example, the giraffes that are here, they're on this huge field, and apparently they make use of every inch of it. If you had, say, lions on this field, they wouldn't. They'd probably just find out where their food comes and they'd sit in one corner and that would be the end of it. So you might see, for example, a big cat in a small space, and you might say, isn't it terrible that it's in this small space, but actually put it in a big space, and it really doesn't really want to know most of the time. There is a wonderful case for keeping animals like this in big spaces. There is also a case for keeping other kinds of animals in much smaller spaces. I mean, some animals which don't move around very much, and of course little animals.
Prominent British zoologist Colin Tudge believes Australia is in the forefront of animal conservation. He says attitudes towards zoos in his own country have changed little in the past 2 decades.
I mean, if you ask people, are zoos important for conservation, very often they say yes, but they don't really know what zoos do or how important they really are. I think in my country, zoos are still looked down upon as something which, is really for children. One thing I'd like to see, which hasn't happened, is that people should appreciate animals in zoos at least as much as they appreciate, let us say, great paintings in galleries. I mean, we revere the paintings in the Louvre, if that were to burn down, we'd say, wasn't that terrible? And yet if a zoo were to burn down or go out of business with all the creatures inside, we'd say, well, so what, who cares?
Despite our changing attitude to wildlife, there's still thousands of animal species disappearing every year. In fact, it's ironic that so many of us agonise over the well-being of an individual animal and yet ignore the millions wiped out by the destruction of their habitat.
Well, zoos are becoming more important all the time. I mean good zoos, because I don't think most people realise just how endangered animals really are in the wild. People have said the real way to conserve animals is to conserve the places where they live, that is, to conserve their habitats. And that's fine, I mean, that must be the ideal. But the fact of the matter is that for some animals, that is no longer an option even now. I mean, for very big animals like tigers, conservation in the wild on its own is just not going to work. The thing that people don't appreciate is that for a population to be viable, which means to survive in the long term and endure all the sort of slings and arrows of wild existence, the population has to be big. And there's a ballpark figure which says, if an animal population is smaller than about 500 individuals, then in the long term, i.e. a few decades, few centuries, it's almost bound to go extinct.
With improved conditions and a better understanding of animals, there's a marked improvement in zoo breeding. Priorities have changed in the past 2 decades, and captive breeding is now of huge importance. But it isn't just the rare animals that give rise to a celebration. This is Werribee's latest arrival, 6 days old and all humps and legs. She's already proving to be quite a draw card here because although camels are quite common in Australia, feral in some parts, they're still one of the most popular exhibits in any zoo.
Because we display savanna or grasslands animals, mostly large, the charismatic African ones, the large Australian kangaroos and so forth, incredible advantage is the space. We're on 200 hectares here, which is marvellous, and that enables us to display them in large natural groupings and wherever possible in mixed exhibits. So you get that whole repertoire of natural behaviour, which is really so important to the welfare of the animal. You get the natural interactions between the species and also among the animals of that particular species. And that is probably equally as important to their health as any of the dietary or veterinary support that we could provide them.
The bars in most modern zoos have gone, but many argue the barriers remain. Animals are still kept in captivity for our own entertainment, and nowhere is there a more obvious example than the elephant. The wide open space of Werribee would appear a more suitable environment for Melbourne Zoo's 2 Asian elephants, but a move out west isn't on the agenda.
We have very much developed Werribee around a savanna theme, and certainly African elephants would fit in there. Asian elephants, perhaps more questionable. When it comes to the welfare of those animals, yes, providing them with more space. But there is an issue of public expectations. Elephants are box office animals. They're what people expect to see. From childhood onwards, people develop an association with the zoo and elephants and some of the other big species. And perhaps one day, if the people of Melbourne want to see elephants at Werribee and not at Melbourne, well, then this is where it will be.
Few animals are more readily identified with a zoo than the elephant, but despite their popularity, they're one of the most difficult animals to keep in captivity. Any enclosure appears too small. Any land allocated is ravaged by the sheer size and movement of the animal. A highly social beast, elephants have a herd mentality, and prospects of breeding with 2 animals is limited. Public attitudes towards these gentle creatures have changed too. Until the early 60s, most zoos offered elephant rides to visitors, a practice which ceased after concerns were voiced about the potential dangers for children. A few years earlier, one of Melbourne Zoo's most popular exhibits, Queenie, caused a stir when she crushed her keeper to death. Despite lurid headlines, Queenie had never been noted for aggression, and for months after the incident, she continued to be the docile animal the zoo had always known. However, her days of carrying children were over, and eventually she was put down on economic grounds. The new role of the elephant has changed its image radically. From a fun figure which interacted with children and keepers, its sense of captivity has now been magnified. And no matter how big their enclosure, today most face the prospect of up to 40 years in permanent confinement.
One of the main advantages Healesville Sanctuary has over other zoos is that its basis has always been in research and conservation. It hasn't inherited many of the problems facing other more conventional establishments where the animals are just on show. So while most zoos are trying to get rid of their concrete and bars in line with today's thinking, Healesville Sanctuary has actually been leading the way.
What we're seeing now is that Healesville Sanctuary is not only becoming a sanctuary for animals, it's also becoming a sanctuary for people. The majority of people in Australia live in urban environments, and to come out into this sort of environment is something that is quite unique and exciting for a lot of them. A lot of people, the first time they've ever seen Australian bush is when they come to Healesville Sanctuary.
Since Healesville Sanctuary, northeast of Melbourne, opened its doors 60 years ago, its commitment has been to the care of Australian wildlife. 30 hectares were set aside to study native fauna for the purpose of medical research. However, the sanctuary grew from a picnic ground with a few animals to a place renowned for its fauna. A first day's taking of 3 and 9pence when 6 adults and 3 children turned up was the seed of an enterprise that today attracts nearly 400,000 visitors a year. But while Healesville's bushland setting provides a perfect backdrop to see some of our own animals, the sanctuary's veterinary research and education programs are at the forefront of native flora and fauna conservation.
The hoods are used to keep the bird quiet, to keep it calm. She was hit by a car last October, November, somewhere near Traralgon. She never had any broken bones. The problem was that she was not independent. She was still relying upon her parents for food and so on. Because she never had the chance to actually learn that with her siblings, there was actually no point in trying to release her immediately. At the moment, she's now trained, we're flying her. She's allowed an hour and a half a day of recreational flying, so we can therefore assess how she's flying and also her fitness levels.
The bird of prey has long symbolised power, yet it remains one of our most vulnerable creatures. Many are brought into the sanctuary after being hit by cars, and 1 in 10 injured birds has been shot. As head keeper of Healesville's birds of prey, Richard Naisbitt not only oversees their rehabilitation, but provides them with flight training. This rebuilds their wing muscles and sharpens unused hunting skills, essential for their eventual return to the wild. To help raise the visitors' appreciation of these birds, keepers give a daily presentation, an event which can prove hazardous, particularly as Lupin, the sanctuary's wedge-tailed eagle, likes to show who's boss.
Watch your head. Wasn't that fun? Okay. Now it'd be nice. Here we go.
This is no ordinary dog. Snowbird is part of the sanctuary's breeding program to ensure the future of the alpine dingo. A daily walk is part of the agenda, but as the animals are taken one at a time, the others tend to make their feelings known too.
They're wondering why they're not going for a walk.
Oh, I see.
They're wondering why Snowbird's the lucky one.
For many years, most people visited zoos to see what we call the megafauna: lions, tigers, elephants and so on, the exotic animals. Australian animals were usually there as window dressing, a tame wallaby for the children to play with. No one really went to a zoo to see a kangaroo. But today there's a radical shift in our thinking, and this place has led the way when it comes to appreciating our own fauna.
People's attitudes towards snakes are usually based on a lot of unnecessary fears and fallacies and tall stories that get spread about snakes, and they therefore have a pretty poor image. Now,
the sanctuary puts heavy emphasis on education, dispelling some popular myths, particularly about these creatures.
A snake will not harm you unless you show some intentions that you're trying to harm it. It is a fact that 95% of all snake bites in Australia are caused by people deliberately trying to catch or kill snakes. So that really speaks for itself.
But the sanctuary's piece de resistance is its nocturnal platypus exhibit, the envy of every zoo in Australia. Although this little mammal is of enormous scientific importance, not much is known of its habits. A research program is starting to shed light on the behaviour of the platypus, which will benefit its long-term habitat needs.
We have a master plan that's taking us certainly into the next 20 years or so, and what we'll be doing here in our unique environment is looking at mining deeper rather than broader. Where our collection is focused on southeastern Australia and animals that live in this habitat, and we'll be taking people in depth into that, looking at the invertebrate life, looking at fungus, looking at reptiles, right throughout the sanctuary, the Aboriginal culture, really mining a whole lot deeper into what is a terrific environment.
Chief Curator Gary Slater has a big task ahead of him, but nobody knows better the crucial role his sanctuary plays in making the public aware of conservation. This wild zoo in the hills brings home a glimpse of the reality of life for our native animals, a haven for endangered species, and for some near-extinct animals, the last refuge.
For most people waking up on a Sunday morning, the zoo is a day out, it's entertainment. And we have to entertain them, we have to provide them with what they expect to see. On the other hand, we no longer really want to just pander to what people expect to see. We've evolved beyond that.
And so it's a balancing act. In zoos, we're constantly juggling these commercial imperatives, if you like, on the one hand, and those conservation issues and animal welfare issues, etc., on the other.
And those conservation issues are ultimately what will determine the course of zoos over the next few decades. If much of our wildlife is to be here in 100 years, it will need to be understood, nurtured, and its habitat defended. Of the 10,000 establishments that exhibit live animals, a tenth form the heart of the international zoo network, institutions which work to ensure the survival of endangered or vulnerable species.
One of the key things is that they have to cooperate. And I said that the populations of the animals have to be high. Let us say you need, 500 rhinos or tigers or whatever it is to have a long-term viable population. Well, of course, no individual zoo can keep that number of animals. And, you know, if it keeps a dozen, it's probably doing well. What that means, therefore, is that all the zoos in a region like Australia, or like Australia plus Southeast Asia, or like North America, and sometimes all the zoos in the world, have got to cooperate so that they treat all their animals of a given type as a single population, a single breeding population, and exchange animals in order to, you know, maintain the genetic diversity and so on.
Today, operating a zoo is serious business, and there's little time for institutions which exhibit a miscellaneous collection of animals in the name of conservation.
And there's a lot of zoos around that do just keep a few animals, often not endangered animals, and just breed them and show baby animals to the public and say, look, we are involved in conservation because we produced a few baby animals. Now that is, as it were, junk. I mean, unless they're cooperating with everybody else genetically, unless they're focusing on the right species, then they are wasting everybody's time.
Victoria's zoos, Melbourne, Healesville and Werribee, operate under one board, and their diversity enables them to provide one of the best education, breeding and research programs in the world. But the bottom line for any zoo is economic viability, and the recreation aspect is still an essential ingredient for its survival.
Zoos are very expensive places to operate, and because we now accept that conservation is the real raison d'etre for zoos these days, that has to be the thing that drives us, and hence we need to be, we are continuing to develop our collections, both this institution and all of us around the world, towards collections of more conservation value, so that we can really target the animals and the plants that are under most threat, that need the most work.
These days it's rare to see animals born in the wild exhibited in zoos. 99% are born in captivity. With statistics like this, interaction between zoos and other conservation bodies worldwide is all the more important. According to Melbourne Zoo's Director of Conservation Programs, Chris Banks, it's a long way from the days when zoos were single entities, seldom operating outside their own walls.
It's a very complex process. There are a lot of people involved, all the way through the various animal divisions, curators, keepers in charge, keepers, veterinarians are involved. There are things like species management issues. With many of the species we hold in our zoos these days, we need to be able to manage them very intensively. We need to know where they've come from exactly, what their genetic relationships are, who their parents are, what their genetic values are, and so that we can maintain diversity within that captive population. We have to be aware of the costs involved in maintaining those animals. We have to be very active in meeting their behavioural requirements, their ecological requirements as much as we can. We have to put a lot of work into making sure that their total well-being is taken care of.
It's been said that conservation is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And while zoos now play a major role in preserving wildlife, there is no sovereign remedy for extinction. During the next century, thousands of animals and plants will be wiped out through ignorance, demand for natural resources and population growth. But we're beginning to understand. And for many creatures, that means a second chance.
I'd hate to be in the world where there were just no animals. I mean, they just make the world a much, much more interesting, beautiful place to be. But I think in the end, you just say, look, one conserves animals because that is the right thing to do. And to me, that's the end of it. That's what we should be doing, and that's why we do it.